the American dream. He's a staunch advocate and leader of efforts that increase student success to and ultimately completion of post-secondary education. He has worked in and with higher ed institutions for nearly 30 years. Dr. Koch has substantive experience in undergraduate education administration, redesign of unjust education systems, strategic planning, fundraising, reaffirmation of accreditation, post-secondary access and success, and enrollment management efforts. His work also includes extensive grant writing and fundraising with support coming from sources such as, get ready for this list, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Coca-Cola, ECMC Foundation, Gear Up, Kresge Foundation, Lilly Endowment Incorporated, Lumina Foundation, the National Science Foundation, and the Target Corporation. Dr. Koch holds a baccalaureate degree in history and German from the University of Richmond, a master's degree in history from the University of Richmond, a master's degree in higher ed administration from the University of South Carolina, and a PhD from Purdue University in American Studies. He was an American Council on Education Fellow in the year 2013 and 14. And finally, Dr. Koch's scholarly and professional interests are focused on student success and the ways in which colleges and universities both reflect and shape democracy and culture in the US. Through this work, he serves as a passionate advocate for historically underrepresented and underserved students, seeing higher education as a vehicle for advancing equity and social justice. He's the author of several books and publications and has served on a number of boards and committees that focus its work on success for all students. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Drew Koch.
How about now? Yes. Phyllis, thank you very much. I have to take that bio down off our webpage, by the way. It's much too long. Colleagues, it's wonderful to be with you here today. Move this down because it's much too loud. It's wonderful to be here with you today. I am joined by a number of my colleagues from the Gardner Institute. I know we gave you Phyllis gave you a bit of an overview of the workshop that we will definitely be doing tomorrow. Today's time together will be interactive at points and times, but this is really a setup on the Gateway course redesign work that we're doing tomorrow. Not a setup in a negative way, but a setup hopefully in a positive way. Although, as is typical of the case, I happen to, a little bit of backdrop, have the privilege of working with my life partner, my wife of nearly 30 years, Dr. Sarah Stein-Koch. And when you work with your wife in that regard, she can be one of your staunchest advocates and one of your best informed critics. And she said to me once again, as I left, whatever you do, Drew, just don't depress everyone again, right? So I will tell you that what I'm about to share is not always pretty, but the fact that you're here indicates that you want to lean into it and you want to make sure that the outcomes do become prettier or better over the course of time at your own institution. So thank you for that in advance. Now, let me introduce a few folks who came with me, and actually they're the real talent on the team. I am joined, they're in the front of the room here because they're A+ students, by Josh Calkins, one of our fellows at the Gardner Institute. He's been a fellow with us for 6 years, very focused on faculty development pedagogy work. I'm also joined by a senior fellow, Dean Ed Willis, also in the front of the room here. Ed has extensive experience in enrollment management, student affairs, student success, probably a host of other things at an array of institutions, including Norfolk State and Southern University, Baton Rouge, University of Michigan. There were like 12 I've forgotten since then, Ed. But we've been fortunate to have him as senior fellow with the Institute for 5 years now. We also have founding president and Dean of University College at IUPUI, founding president of the Stella and Charles Gutman Community College, Scott Evanbeck, with us. Dr. Evanbeck is a fellow with the Institute and also is a member of our board of directors. I am privileged actually to have two members of our board of directors present. You will know one of the other ones is Dr. Aaron Thompson. So they're here to make sure I always tell the truth 100% of the time, and they hold me accountable for it, including in performance evaluations. So it is good to have you all here. We will tomorrow also have a colleague with us, Dr. Victoria McGillen. She will be joining us remotely, virtually, but she is always here in spirit, even if she's not here in body. So just let you know that's the team moving forward. Now let me spend a little time and talk about not so much who this guy, because Phyllis did a wonderful job reading my bio, although I'll go into it and reveal things that were not in the bio. But more importantly, let me talk about the organization that I'm privileged to work with. I've been with the Gardner Institute as an employee full-time since 2010. So I am in my 13th year. I will start my 14th sometime in July. I am currently, as was shared, the CEO. I did not come to the Gardner Institute as such as that. The Institute's a 24 going on 25-year-old not-for-profit organization that helps colleges and universities, individual educators, higher ed organizations, and foundations improve teaching, learning, student success, and completion. That's what we do and who we do it with. And our big why, and this is the second sentence in the mission statement, is to advance broader societal equity and social justice goals, right? That actual big why is there because a program officer at Lumina Foundation turned and said, we know why you exist, but apparently you don't tell that to the public. So we decided, instead of implicitly focusing on those elements, explicitly stating it, and with input from the board of directors, we did just that. So this is how foundations help you in ways above and beyond money, with wisdom and guidance. So thanks for that, colleagues and friends at Lumina. I'll skip me. I want to go to you, and I want to make this immediately interactive, at least to some extent. I'm going to ask you to jot down in a minute, or now even, but over the span of a minute, what you think the phrase gateway course completion line means, right? Because I'm going to tell you what I think it means, but what matters at least as much, probably more, is what you think it means. So let's take a minute, jot it down on a piece of paper, an iPad, a phone, your colleague's arm, whatever works for you in terms of taking some notes down. And fair warning, I will ask some of you to share. Okay, I'm giving you about 15 seconds. And time. We'll now enter into a period where some of you, many of you, will have the opportunity to enter and get your name posted on a plaque out in the hall. It's called the plaque of people who are brave and share in Drew's workshop. There's an acronym, it's crazy. So who's going to be the person who starts this off and gets their name on said plaque? Who wants to share their definition of gateway course completion line? Please, the only rule is you tell us who you are and where you're from. And you have to yell.
Sure.
Yes.
I'm Stephanie Hyman. I'm a big art community at in Bowling Green, and you get this. The first thing that I thought of is the line is a separator looking through the lens at the community technical college, with this line of separation between those who earn a credential versus those who do not, because they do not play together.
Got you. So the gateway courses are catalysts, and there's a line that separates those who complete and those who do not, right? So That's part of my answer too. So yes, others. She was not the only one who did the homework assignment. From the back, please. Hi, Mark. So it's in your definition, it's a student-focused point where they're able to complete foundational level courses. Gotcha. Okay. This half of the room is rocking it. Now we're moving to the middle.
I think I
Hi,
looked at it
Maggie.
differently. I looked at MCTC in success. So I wasn't thinking about it like a line that separates. I was thinking about it like a line, how you get from point A to point B. So I put how the institution supports the students to help them get through.
So it's a directional line, right? Moving students along, progress. Sure, sure. Okay, well, this half of the room really rocked it. Don't let them. Please, thank you.
On top of the completion of those courses, that gives them the foundation.
Gotcha. So you definitely emphasize the core and courses within the core there. Okay, so that's part of the definition. Okay, so we have 4 equally valid in their own ways definition. I'm going to spend a little time telling you what I mean and what I'm drawing on for purposes of this. And by the way, you'll see elements of all 4 definitions in what I'm about to share. Okay, I need to give some acknowledgement. First off, my context. What makes me, quote unquote, an expert on gateway courses? Well, the first thing that makes me an expert on gateway courses is that I nearly failed a number of them. Now, a little context on that. I was fortunate, unlike my parents, to be able to go away to a selective residential liberal arts college to do my undergrad. I really had no clue what I was getting myself into, but I just knew that's what my parents really wanted for me, and I was able to do it. My father, leading up to my college experience for 4 years, had been ill with cancer. And right before I went for welcome week, he went back into the hospital. Now, in our world, he went into the hospital over the 4 years, probably about a dozen times, and he always got out. On 3rd day of welcome week, I got a phone call saying, he's probably not coming out of the hospital alive, come home. So I did. I missed 2 weeks. Over the course of time, my father passed away. We had his funeral, and I spent some time with my mother still, considering whether I would or wouldn't go back. And she really wanted me to go back. I really kind of sort of did too, but I wanted to be a supportive son. I went back having missed the first 2 weeks of classes. Now, I didn't think anything important really ever went on in the first 2 weeks of classes. And I was wrong. And unfortunately, I didn't realize how wrong I was until about 8-9 weeks into the term, at which point it was beyond the point of recovery in a few courses. In one of my courses, calculus, the professor ate lunch with me for 4 weeks, not straight, but every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we had lunch together. She really tried. I tried, but I was lost. So in that course, I earned a grade. It was a gentleman's grade because she asked me if I would ever take and be in a program of study that required calculus. And I wasn't as dumb as my grade would indicate. I said, of course not, because I knew we were bargaining. And she said, in that case, you will earn a D-. I did not even know a D- was possible. But there it was on my transcript. I earned a D in microeconomics, a C+ in chem for majors, and 2 A's, both of which are in German, because if I hadn't earned A's in German, although my father, Wolfgang, was no longer living, my mother, Waltraud, would have had more reason to be depressed than already, right? So, I mean, it was the language we spoke growing up. Point I get at is I struggled, and I really questioned whether I belonged there. And I definitely changed programs of study as a result of my outcomes. But there was something else I noticed and knew. I had teammates who looked nothing like me. I was at a predominantly white institutions, over 90% white students. Yet many of my teammates were students of color. So when I didn't succeed in gateway courses and I questioned whether I belonged there or not, it was not because of the color of my skin. For my classmates and teammates who had similar challenges, they didn't always have that luxury. Tell you, when I talk about the gateway course completion line, I recognize, particularly as I'm about to define it now, that there are a lot of things to which I am blind that I did not directly experience, for which I have empathy and with which I will proceed with humility and grace. But I'll also tell you that as I talk about this, there are a lot of things I just don't know. And that's why I will proceed with humility and grace and tell you there's things I don't know, particularly what it's like to be a student of color in gateway courses in the United States today. Right now, I am drawing on work of W.E.B. Du Bois, and particularly an essay in a 1905 book, Du Bois. There were various essays actually that went into it, coming from the latter 19th century, Souls of Black Folks. And it's actually the foreword, the first essay in that compilation. And a memorable sentence at the start of that essay is the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Now I'm emphasizing that because in that era, Du Bois was talking about legal separation of races through Jim Crow laws, the color line. Okay, so there were some people who may turn around and say, well, Drew, why are you citing Du Bois 25 years later or 125 years later practically? And my assertion, and I'll back it up with evidence, is because the color line and the income line and the gender line are alive and well in 2023. They're subtler forms of racist or classist activities that transpired. They go unnoticed because they're not labeled as such. They're not upheld by Jim Crow laws anymore, but they have equal and arguably equally as insidious outcomes for students of color, first generation students, rural students. And I, again, sadly can back it up with evidence, which is why Sarah said, just don't depress everyone with what you're about to share. Now, I want to share a bit here, and I'm going to challenge the definition that was shared earlier, not because I disagree with Lily. I like Lily a ton. I respect Lily immensely. And I think math and English really count. And I think there are about 25 other gateway courses that count too, that get short shrift because everybody's focused on math and English. See, it allows people to say, instructors and others, man, that sucks for the math and English department. And we can proceed on, rock on in the way we always have. And the answer is no, you can't. Okay, again, supporting with evidence. Now, what evidence? Well, Drew is going to tell you about the evidence. What we have here, and I realize it may be a little challenging to see from the back there, but our data compiled from 8 foundational level, 8 gateway courses. And incidentally, we're using the term gateway intentionally and defining it as follows. They are predominantly high enrollment courses. Now, some people say, well, we don't have any courses that are high enrollment within or across sections. So we work with a lot of small institutions in rural areas that have 10 sections of 20. And that's a large enrollment course for them because it accounts for a quarter of their enrollment, right? So within or across sections, that's one aspect of the definition. The second is they have significant levels of D grades, F grades, W's on the transcript. And some people are like, well, W's, why do they matter? It's a withdrawal. Well, for satisfactory academic progress, they matter. W's on the transcript and I's for incompletes. And we emphasize the I because in a few smaller studies we've done, they frequently turns into F's when they don't get completed, right? So we compile that together, DFWI rates. Note I didn't say a number because context matters. And an aggregate DFWI rate actually can hide a lot of things. So we want to make sure the DFWI rate is understood in the context of the institution and you lean into it, really lean into it and disaggregate the data. And then the last element with all of this, right? High enrollment and high DFWI rates is that they're foundational in nature. And by foundational, we largely mean 100, 200, 1,000, 2,000, whatever numbering system you have. predominantly enrolling first and second year students, although in our analysis, we've found that some of them enroll a lot of juniors and seniors, especially students with junior senior status who transfer and then have to either retake the course or didn't take it to begin with, right? So something to keep in mind there in terms of our definition. I also need to give credit where credit is due. We're using gateway as opposed to gatekeeper, weed out, killer, because you set your framework with your words, right? The word gateway, as far as we can tell, came in 1992 from the Great Gateway Initiative at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And I have the former dean of University College here. So I want to be able to acknowledge and give credit where it came from, right? So that's our definition. Now, we looked at 8 gateway courses in this study. And by we, I mean my colleague, Dr. Brent Michael Drake of the Peoria, Illinois Drakes. Brent is now the Senior Vice President for Operations and Research at the Gardner Institute. He was prior to that, Vice Provost for Decision Support at UNLV. Prior to that, he was Chief Data Officer at Purdue University. And all along, he's been the commissioner of my fantasy football league. So, you know, dude knows data, right? But Brent helped compile this data. And we compiled this data from, initially, we reached out to 50 plus institutions that the Gardner Institute was working with at the time on course redesign and other forms of undergrad education redesign. And we had their student level data, but we wanted to know for sure we were comparing apples to apples. So we asked them to confirm which was their foundational level or principles of accounting course, their general psychology course, their foundational level bio and chem, major, non-major, their first 2 college credit bearing math courses in both calc and algebra, and their writing course, right? Notice I said it's not just math and English, but we've counted math and English. Now, why only those 8, Drew? Well, that's a great question. That's because that's where the greatest overlap occurred in the institutions that were in our sample set, right? So we wanted to look at courses that made sense for them at the time. If we did this study now, it'd probably be 25 courses total, including those. So we have to do it again. Josh has already told me 3 times in the past 24 hours, it's time. So we won't. Right? Because Josh said so, but we know we do. Now, I've told you a little bit about the courses. Let me tell you about their enrollment. Those 2, the writing course, the English rhetoric comp, intro writing, what have you, about 96,000 students across 36 institutions. Right? When you said, Drew, you told us 50. Well, we asked about 50 to tell us 36 got back. Right? So we went with what we had. About 1.2 million student grades in that set, so pretty decent sample size, and 96,000 in English. In the intro psych at 34 institutions. Not all the institutions had the courses that we were asking about, 92,000. And then in calc, that one right there, a little over 13,000, right? So it gives you a sense, and that was across 31 institutions. So it gives you a sense of the sample size. Now, let me tell you what we found. And I'm going to pick on history. I'm not going to pick on history for the same reason that I can pick on my 2 sisters and feel good about it, actually enjoy it. But you can't, because I'll get upset. I can pick on history because I have 3 degrees in history. So it's like picking on my family members, right? I'm a historian by training. Note, I didn't start with analysis in bio because usually when I do, people turn and say, do you even teach bio? And the answer is no, but I have taught history, right? In both the secondary and post-secondary levels. So we were fortunate to be able to share data with our colleagues at the American Historical Association early on in the work. They've been a tremendous partner in this. They actually took this essay that I'm about to draw on to the Mellon Foundation, and they got funding from Mellon to work with 11 colleges and universities along with the Gardner Institute to redesign a number of foundational level history courses. But let me tell you why no one was willing to give that money, right? What we looked at, and that's the cover, the May 2017 Perspectives on History magazine, where this was written up, beautiful thing. It's 1,500 words. You're like, Drew, really? You're capable of brevity? I am, just that once. Wrote up an essay titled Many Thousands Fail. And it's a take from a James Baldwin essay, Many Thousands Gone. And in that Baldwin essay, and some of you might have been with me yesterday, know I'm a Baldwin fan. This is a different Baldwin essay. I read many of them and give credit to all of them. Baldwin had written that the history of the United States is the history of African Americans in the United States. In the very next sentence, not even the next sentence, after the colon, he said it's not a pretty story. Okay, so when I was considering this evidence, I happen to also be rereading Baldwin. And it turned out that the history of student success in history courses is also the history or story of students of color, low-income students in history courses. And it also isn't a pretty story. What we found, and that there you have it. Let me go real quick. The green, well, that's the light blue. That's the DFWI rate for white students, which is about 22%. So about 22% of 28,000 students in that course, of white students in that course, earned a DFWRI. What you'll note here is the average for the course at about 25%. Now, people have said to me, well, that's cool, right? 25%, that means 3/4 of the students do well, they can study history, they can go into other programs to study. That's one way of interpreting. It's not the way you should interpret it, but that is a way to interpret it. The reason why I say you shouldn't interpret it is we have to disaggregate that data. And I'm showing the disaggregation by race ethnicity right now. Okay, we did a disaggregation by income, Pell as the proxy, and we saw similar outcomes. But what you'll see is that the DFWI rate for readily admissible, nobody on a probationary admission status, nobody provisional admission, everybody was readily admissible. So preparation or admission status shouldn't have been a factor, at least not to the extent that some could argue. What we saw is that African-American students had a 44% DFWI rate. Native American students had a little over 40% DFWI rate. And Latinx students had just shy of about a 35% DFWI rate. So sadly, demographics are destiny in history courses. Now, there have been people who have said to me, Drew, oops, we're going in reverse. They didn't say that. They say, Drew, you know, not everyone's a geek like you. And I say, thank goodness they're not, right? They get invited to parties. I don't. Because I want to talk about this. But the problem is that, yeah, only 2% of all students in the United States go on to become history majors. But history is such a core course in general ed. And there's something else that happens if you do poorly in even one core course in gen ed. But before you say adding to, well, it stinks for English and math and it stinks for history too, it stinks for every course we looked at, right? And I just want to emphasize this. Those lines, they could go throughout. White students always had lower DFWI rates than the course mean. And students of color always had higher DFWI rates than the course mean, right? In this case, if you tried to predict who succeeds in gateway courses, demographics is destiny. So again, there's the, well, maybe, and I take big issue with the phrase, but I've heard maybe those students just don't belong in business or don't belong in that major. There are obvious issues with that statement. But here's the other issue with that. That assumes the student doesn't do well in one gateway course, but they find some other major at the institution and life goes on as normal. Alas, that isn't supported by the data. Right? What we found is that when a student in history or any one gateway course had a D in FWRI in just one gateway course, and they were in otherwise good academic standing. In other words, if they didn't need that course to graduate, they were just taking it to round things out for financial aid purposes, and they had 120 credits, the institution would have given them a degree, right? One gateway course, good academic standing. They were significantly less likely to return to the institution the next year if they were eligible to return, right? Significantly. Now, we have not had time to do the study to look at grad rates on students because we had query IDs. We couldn't link it back to the National Student Clearinghouse. We can now. And that's why we need to redo that study, Josh. But the good news or bad news is that Cliff Edelman did that study twice with every student who enrolled in higher ed over an 8-year period of time. And he had similar outcomes on 20% or more of the grades being in the DFWI range, being a great predictor of retention. But what he also found is not only did those students not return to an institution where they earned the grade, they did not earn a degree anywhere at significantly higher rates anywhere over the 8 years included in both of his studies, right? So I'm bringing this up to say, yes, it's math and English, and it's history, and it's accounting. And by the way, even though it's not on there, it's intro poli-sci, it's sociology, it's economics, right? We know this because we have the other data that I'm not sharing here. But it's the significance of any foundational level course. Now, I want to emphasize a few things. When I talk about this, it is natural, particularly for my faculty colleagues, to get a little defensive, right? Sometimes they say, we never knew this. This data has never been shared with us. Those are good reasons to get angry, right? And get defensive. In other cases, well, it's been shared, but we haven't been supported to do something about it. You know, we had one interaction at one of Josh's institutions where a faculty member stood up, 153 of them in the room. I remember the number. And said, what you need to understand, like she said you, like she was spitting out rancid meat. She was not happy with me, right? But what you need to understand is that I went to an AAU institution, earned a PhD and got a tenure track job. And I didn't have 5 minutes on pedagogy while I did so, right? So it was one of the few times I could actually think on my feet. I asked in the room, I don't know if you remember this, Josh. I asked in the room, by show of hands, who in their graduate programs had a course, access to a Center for Teaching Excellence. Mind you, this is about 15 years ago, so there's been a little while. 3 hands were raised in the room, right? So I'm not blaming faculty. I'm naming them as agents, and I'm naming them as persons we have to support as we begin to do this work, right? So I want to emphasize that because it's real easy for people to say, well, you're just putting it all on faculty. No, I'm naming it, and I'm naming faculty as primary agents, and I think often we leave them out of the student success equation. Yesterday, Gardner Institute had an opportunity to work with boards and presidents from 8 Kentucky institutions, along with our Association for Governing Board colleagues. Dr. Meryl Schwartz is here. I was remiss, Senior Vice President from AGB. I was remiss in introducing her. So Meryl, I'm correcting my sin of omission here. And when we surveyed them at the beginning and we said, who has responsibility for student success? Meryl, do you remember the outcomes of that? Yeah, 14% board. So good news, board, you don't have to worry about it nearly at all. About 45% administration. I would say about another 25 to 30% staff, and real small, maybe not even 20% faculty, right? Less than 20%. Now I'm doing this from memory. It could be fuzzy. We have the slide. I'll get it your way if you really want it. But I'm bringing it up to just basically say that should have been quarter. It's a shared responsibility. And Gateway course success is a shared responsibility. So let me go in a little bit and ask you, before we launch into some constructive things, so I can go home to Sarah and say, I didn't just totally depress them, right? We're going to go into some of the things that we've seen done and we've supported getting done, and what Josh and Vicki and Scott and Ed will support figuring out with you tomorrow in the workshop session. We're going to do that. We're going to spend some time doing that, be constructive on it. But before we do that, I'd like you to get with a partner, maybe 2, so dyads or triads. You pick your friends, you're sitting close to some of them perhaps, and just have a conversation around this for 5 minutes. What surprised you in those outcomes and why? All right, we'll do a little reporting out, but 5 minutes. And if you don't have a friend or a colleague next to you, this is like Girl Scouts. And I used to have to go with my mom to Girl Scouts because I had 2 sisters. Yeah, make new friends. Keep the old, one is silver, the other is gold. We'll be back in 5 minutes. Colleagues, if you haven't switched it up, if you paired up, or if there's three of you, let the other person speak if you've not allowed that to happen yet. We got about 2 minutes yet. Now it's working. Okay, we've now come back to a sharing portion of the interactive discussion this afternoon. We're going to switch this one up a bit. It's not that I don't want to know what you think, but I want to know what you thought you heard from your colleague. So, Dr. Mayberry, unless I'm putting you on the spot. Yeah, well, it's role modeling behavior that others will emulate, right? And you're getting your name on the plaque. I mean, it's a given. Dr. Mayberry, what's one thing you heard from your colleague? And if the answer is, well, we're talking about other stuff, then make something up. Make it sound good. Yeah. What surprised your colleague? Could you like belt it out? Yeah, so.
My name on the plaque.
Gotcha, yeah. Okay, so that was the definition around gateway courses. Now so your surprise is he wasn't surprised, or there was no surprise at all, right? Yeah.
And I say this for a number of years, and we keep asking the same question, getting the same result, but we haven't seen a concentrate. Oh, that's scary. That's, you know, you have
Yeah, no, but it's super helpful. Thank you.
I wasn't surprised because we've asked this question of ourselves for a long time now, and we've seen the data that's been presented in different ways, but it says the same thing. The question now becomes why I wasn't surprised, and it's because that was the adage that says if you keep doing the same thing expecting different results, right? What are we going to do differently about the learning experience that students have so that we can see a different outcome?
Well, and that's the question. That's also the call to action. Right. And that's why I'm excited. Hopefully I haven't scared you off. If I have, just know that it's Josh and Ed and Scott and Vicky who are doing it tomorrow, and they're far better than me. Right. So, but I will say that's what we'll be digging into and leaning into tomorrow. And I think part of it is I often use the metaphor of hospitalists and hospitals and healthcare when I think about higher ed. And let me just ask, do you want to go to a hospital where they're like, well, about 45% of our patients die, but that's just the way it is? No. So why would you want a student in a gateway course to have that sort of experience? Right. So thank you. Let's do one more friend sharing what new or old friend, not old in terms of ages, but a long established friend. One more sharing. And again, who you are and who the heck is your friend?
Shane Armstrong from Owensboro Community Technical College, and our colleague is from Union College. And two of us teach in the first year experience program. And what we're surprised by is that wasn't a gateway course.
It should be.
Yeah, we think it should be.
It's on our list.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
My-
it's on
my
our
work
list.
here
It's
is
just
done.
not on that list. Yeah, it's not in that study, but we've included it now in our analyses. I will say that there have been published studies on this, which you almost be like, really? No, duh. But it's been supported. The published studies on the fact that failing the first year seminar or getting an unsatisfactory grade, a D, a withdrawal in a first year seminar, is a direct predictor of attrition. Now we know it's in these courses too, by the way, but often that really surprises people. So it'll be in our next round of analysis. Yep.
Dr. Armstrong already mentioned what surprised us. What did not surprise us, me particularly, is that the gateway course completion line runs across racial lines too. And it's no surprise, we have seen it in every area. So for these courses, it lined up the same as it would for any other course.
Yeah. Now, I did not get in. We broke down by first generation college status. We broke down by gender. We broke down by, we've seen a lot the same. The element in gender, it's females perform better than males. It doesn't explain why females leave the STEM disciplines in higher numbers. For that, you need to contact Elaine Seymour, right? She's done 2 books on that topic, talking about leading revisited. But okay, thank you for now. Now I'm going to go to being able to go home, and not because I want to run away, but because I want to be able to enter and say, well, Sarah, I did talk about things that can be done, right? And that's going to move into. But to do that, I'm going to do it in the way that I generally do things as an American Studies historian, right? And I'm going to draw on James Walvin's book. Scott, what was the name of your chief of staff at Gutman? Linda, yeah. Linda Marions. She and Jay Walvin are like tight buddies. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I was having a conversation with Scott there. It just dawned on me. Walvin in Slavery and Small Things, brilliant book. Otherwise, I wouldn't be referencing it, right? But what Walvin did is he looked at the history of various commodities in the Atlantic world. So commodities like sugar, mahogany, tobacco, and he examined those, and he wrote the history around them, and he traced the history, as always seemed to be the case, back to the enslavement of Africans and indigenous persons, but disproportionately Africans, but also indigenous in the New World. And what Walvin's hypothesis in there was that Europeans, by and large, and every level of socioeconomic level of European, benefited enormously from the enslavement of persons from Africa and or from indigenous communities. And often they had no idea they were doing so. In other words, they had what Walvin referred to as a tyranny of distance. They didn't see it. They didn't know anybody in it. They could argue they didn't participate in it. But they worked in the Meissen porcelain factory in Germany, which was created to address consumer demands for coffee and tea. They bought and consumed sugar. And the examples go on and on and on and on, right? So every class and millions of persons benefited from this without ever actually seeing the labor, the enslaved, the forced labor that made that possible, right? So that's Walvin's case in that. And I happened to be reading that when I was contacted by some folks at the National Teaching and Learning Forum. And they asked me about inequity in certain practices. And it dawned on me, just as there was a tyranny of distance in Walvin's rule. And by the way, I have to be cautious when I compare things to slavery. The only thing that compares slavery is slavery, right? But there are inequitable practices, right? And what I did in Big Inequity in Small Things is basically say there's a tyranny of practice where we use or do certain things because we've always done them. And we never question who benefits or doesn't benefit by the pedagogy or the approach, right? So what I'm going to do is talk about a few examples, but also hopefully give you some hope, right? And some things to build on tomorrow as we go into the workshop. I want to start first with lecture. Oops, go back, Drew. All right, you're going to say, yeah, Drew, you've been basically lecturing us about 90% of the time, and you are right. lecture isn't a bad thing. Lecture alone as the only modality or tool or approach in pedagogy is not a good thing. And it's particularly bad for students who come from under-resourced families, under-resourced schools, students who are first in their family to go to college. Basically, many of the populations that Dr. Thompson or Massa McKinney talked about earlier today, right? Kentucky's significant segment of Kentucky's population, your students. Now, there's good news in this because remember, Drew said he did about 90% lecture just now, and that's convenient. It's also by design. And I'm going to go to David Friedman's work, and it's actually Friedman and then 17 other names, and an article published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's like a legit thing, right? When you get into the National Academy of Sciences, I mean, it's not some history thing. And I say this, what Friedman did with his colleagues with a meta-analysis of nearly over 225 studies on active learning. And what Friedman and his colleagues found is that active learning works and is so effective at closing inequitable performance gaps that had they been doing this as a medical study, they would have had to stop it for benefit. There was no sense keeping the experiment going because they were doing harm by continuing, right? They just wanted everybody to have active learning. But the other thing, and this is why I kept coming back to the 90%, that Freeman's and his colleagues said is, you didn't have to flip the course. You didn't have to do active learning all the time. The threshold was about 10%. So a couple of experiences of thinking, pairing, sharing, note-taking dyads or triads, exam wrappers, and if those are foreign concepts, that's okay. Josh is here to decipher Drew tomorrow. But yes, yeah, thanks, man. Right? You don't have to do a lot to make it effective. And you can do it in large lectures. There are ways to do that, right? So good news is a little bit of active learning goes a long way. An important takeaway in all this. And that's something to think. Now, I want to talk a bit about out-of-class support. Huge fan of supplemental instruction, huge fan of peer-assisted learning, huge fan of all sorts of tutoring, colossal fan. Where I actually get frustrated with it is when you have a student who's working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, has children at home, and you tell them, in addition to taking 12 to 15 credits, go to the tutoring lab. It just doesn't happen. Right? Kay McClenny has written the phrase, at-risk students don't do optional. So if we know this, why do we make things that we know are good for them optional? Right? Our colleagues at Nevada State College, open access institution in the desert in Henderson, Nevada, 4-year open access institution. Looks a lot like community college, but it's a 4-year, primarily baccalaureate granting institution. 1 building short of being a quad. That's right, they have 3 buildings, not 4. But they've come a long way because they used to only have a warehouse that was scorpion infested, but I'm going down a rabbit hole. But what I will say is there they had an excellent supplemental instruction program, an excellent peer tutoring program, an excellent peer advising program. They're also very close to Las Vegas. And many of their students can literally make $80,000 to $120,000 a year parking cars. So they have to have a reason for them to stay enrolled, right? Above and beyond getting a good job or earning money, right? They also have to make sure that they embed what they do in courses. So rather than having 3 excellent programs that no one ever used, or barely anyone used, they had those course coordinators or those service coordinators work together and work with faculty and embed the peer assistance in the course. So every student got it. And they also removed then stigma, because it wasn't the equivalent, Shakespearean equivalent of get thee to a nunnery, get thee to tutoring, right? That didn't happen because they were all getting that reinforced in the course. As a matter of fact, it works so well, 9 percentage point increase in first to second year retention rates and closing of inequitable retention rate gaps for students who were in the gateway courses that had the peer assistant learners in them, right? Worked so well that the students actually gave feedback and said, hey, a little less time with the faculty and a little more time with them. So they had to rethink that, right? They didn't want them to say less faculty. They just but it's very effective. But it's a matter of embedding in there. That takes work, but it's highly effective, right? Feedback early and often. Anecdote illustrating what I mean. Again, working with a historian, a friend of mine. I was talking about early and frequent feedback. Ideally, non-high risk, non-punitive to start, but in a manner that helps have transparency in what's going on in the course and have the students who maybe don't have that social and cultural capital develop it so they know what it is that's expected in the course, right? Went through a couple of illustrations of that, and a friend of mine said, Drew, I totally get it. I was like, awesome, wow, one of the rare occasions I was actually clear. He said, but we can't do that. And I was like, Kevin, what do you mean you can't do that? He's like, well, Drew, we have a 16-week course. We give like 80% of our grade in the last 2 weeks. And like he didn't finish the sentence, right? He was like, oh, right. So even those designs, right, making sure that early and frequent can occur, right? So that those who get 8 weeks into a course and maybe don't realize they're earning or making their way towards a D- in calculus, actually maybe get a clue beforehand, right? I'm not blaming the professor, but I am naming her as an agent in this, right? Policies. Let's talk particularly about late registration. Now, this is loaded. I shared this about 2 weeks ago at a wonderful liberal arts institution in Ohio. Friends with the chief academic officer. I am wondering if I still am, because I turned around and shared the challenges of late registration and how if you know 80% of the students you let in week 2 are going to fail, why do you do it? And there were faculty in the room who were like, yeah, it's his fault. I almost said his name. And I was like, dude, you could have given me a heads up before I publicly outed you. But there are ways, approaches, procedures for dealing with that, right? Even if you can't offer different variations of the course in 8-week or 12-week formats, which has been done in institutions. But even if you can't do that, there's ways of mitigating it and making sure that the students who come in late, very often for reasons well beyond their control, aren't just sort of thrown into the pool and told to swim, right? So something to keep in mind. Grading on a curve, this is what I'll say. Heather Theory and that talking about leaving book that I mentioned earlier. It's talking about leaving revisited, part 2. It only gets better. Heather Theory has a whole chapter on practices like curve grading. And what you need to know is that you'll see a lot of colleagues who say grading on the curve is fair. It's blind. I'm not looking at anybody when I do this. All right, 1/3 will always get a non-passing grade. Now, why don't you go ahead and dig into that 1/3 and then realize that first generation, rural, low income, and or students of color will disproportionately make up the students who fall into that third, right? So what I'm getting at here is maybe even if this is deemed a fair practice, it is not an equitable practice. And you could do something like David Lottie did at the University of Texas at Austin, is say, you know what, rather than make it high stakes and say we're going to grade on a curve and 1/3 of students have to fail because that's the definition of rigor. What if we said the definition of excellence is that every student can get an A? Note I didn't say will get an A, but can get an A, and set up expectations, high expectations with high support right up front. Now, Lottie did that at the University of Texas at Austin. Now, an interesting thing about the University of Texas at Austin, if you know anything about Texas, is one of the top, if not the top flagship in the state. I'm sure there's somebody at Texas A&M or elsewhere who's like really upset right now, right? But they're so selective, actually they're so desired, that the top 10% of high school graduating classes, actually it's a little less than that, I think it's about top 7%, are guaranteed admission. So remember, top 7 of every high school graduating class are guaranteed admission. That's how they do that. So we're talking about bad students. We're talking about some of the best in Texas who go to UT Austin. And yet when Lottie looked at his grades over a 10-year period of time, there were over 2,000 African-American students who took the intro chemistry course that Lottie taught, who had failed it. And he came to the sickening realization that that meant there were over 2,000 African-American students who would never go to medical school because of what happened in the chem course, right? Because it's a prereq. Well, not a prereq, but you have to have chemistry, bio, math, do well in MCATs, but still, you have to have done well in chemistry. So Lottie came up with this premise: what if everybody can get an A? And he built wraparound services. He told everybody they can, and he told them what they needed to do. And he said, lo and behold, Lottie eliminated inequitable performance gaps, particularly those predicted by race, ethnicity, and income in the course. Okay, he was able to do that. So a couple things happened. Number one, they bragged about it on the New York Times, show off. You get this whole thing in the New York Times mag. But they also then kicked him into the administration and made him the senior vice provost for student retention and graduation. And he's since tried to scale it all. I think he's now retired. But what I get at, that's shifting the focus from a high-risk zero-sum game where some will move on and we're maintaining the purity of the discipline, to our nation needs a diverse and well-educated workforce and citizenry. And everybody can earn an A if they're willing to live up to these high expectations, and we're going to support them in doing so. It's a mindset shift. Good news is these fine folks will spend time with you tomorrow to continue working on that mindset shift. So, in the little bit of time we have remaining, how much time do we have remaining, Dr. Calkins? 5 minutes. Okay. I'm not going to have you report out on these, but you will be held accountable tomorrow. I'm setting high expectations, because these fine folks, along with Dr. McGillen virtually, may very well ask you to report out what you wrote down, right? But write down before you leave here, what's one thing you'll do with what you learned today? And what question or comment do you want to share? Not now, but tomorrow, okay? So if you'd write something down for each one of those, take just 3 minutes, and then there are a few things I want to say yet, but I will get you out on time to the reception. Wow, these are squeaky shoes. Sorry, Josh. I'd like to end this just by commending you for being in this room for what, 5 hours? That may have seemed like 5 years. And I want to commend you for what you're going to do tomorrow, not just what you did today. Right? And particularly what you're going to do tomorrow is to pick up where you currently are doing work around gateway courses. And by the way, if you're not, it's a great time to start, but we don't presume you aren't. Right? So pick up where you are doing and be prepared to really lean into it. Right? And I want to end this with an acknowledgement and by drawing on a quote from James Baldwin. I won't go into all the nuances of this essay. I could. Again, why I sit at home and these guys get to go to parties is because I like to talk about things like this. But I'll say at the end of this essay, an essay titled "As Much Truth as One Can Bear," Baldwin makes the case that not everything that you face can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced. So I encourage you to continue on your journey in facing student learning and equitable student learning and success, particularly in gateway courses. And I commend you for doing so, because by doing so, you're attempting to change things by facing them. So thank you for the time together today. My contact info is on this. I will make sure you can find me at the Gardner Institute. Well, you can find me on the Gardner's website. I'm actually on planes more these days. But that's my contact info. Please feel free to reach out. You can tell me why you thought what I did was wrong or stinks, or you can ask for and give me guidance on how to do it better. I welcome any and all of that. Or If you want references or things along those lines, happy to give those too. But thank you for what you're doing for your students and for Kentucky citizens in Gateway courses. Thank you very much.